reminding us of the road that vocational education and training is taking. He knows what we have to do to face up to the changing future, but we need to move within a context. And let's now look towards Europe. In the European Commission in Brussels, they're developing different programs related to skills, employment creation, entrepreneurship. And let's now hear about the new skills agenda. And it's Gregorio de Castro who's going to tell us about the new skills agenda. He's the European Commission's political assistant to the Director of Employment and Training. Welcome.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here again. Last year, I came to give a talk to tell you about what we were preparing in Brussels, what we were cooking in the kitchen in Brussels, and now I'm here to show you the results of that work. I'd like to thank the Basque government for inviting me here, and also the organizers of this event every year who put so much into it. The new European Agenda of Skills and Knowledge has just been adopted. Last Friday it was adopted. And what this new skills agenda is, interestingly enough, or perhaps not so interesting enough, but it coincides with the two priorities that the Basque president set out this morning. One is to fight against unemployment, to get greater integration of those people who are out of the labor market and get them into the labor market, and at the same time drive forward an agenda which from now onwards and in the future becomes an integral part of all the economic workplace and social policies of our countries. Today, and I think Jorge's talk showed that, today we simply cannot imagine economic development or a growth strategy or innovation or even a future without considering increasingly so and in a more integral shape the skills and knowledge and the need to invest in human capital. This is important in the context of Europe, and perhaps even more so in the context of Spain, since the demographic change that we are seeing here in Europe means that it's urgent for us to invest in all human capital, everything that we can in our human capital. At the moment, there's too much human capital that needs to be activated. There's too much human capital that is active but that isn't receiving continuous training, lifelong learning, nor is it receiving the necessary skills updating. So why have we launched this new skills agenda? Quite obviously, the more education you have, the more employable you are. We can see how over the last 15 years, more or less, in the whole of the EU, those groups with a higher education level and that they've achieved throughout their lives and that have got better education, perform better and enjoy better employment rates. That's not surprising, really. But what perhaps is still surprising and also sad is that Spain is still at the bottom of the league when we talk about employment, training, a number of degree holders, and that we are a long way, a very long way from the EU's objectives. In fact, there are only 4 that actually are further than the EU objectives. You can see them. Those are the ones on the left of the screen. The aim by 2020 of the EU is to get that all the adults between the age of 21 and 34 to have that have secondary education to get in a time scale between 1 and 3 years to get onto the labour market. And you can see a lot needs to be done in Spain if that's going to happen. What perhaps even more worrying is that our society's basic skills, and I'm not just talking about the society here in Spain, but in many countries in EU, is very deficient. 1 out of every 5 people on the workplace have insufficient basic reading and writing knowledge. What I'm talking here about is to be able to process a text, to be able to understand fairly complex language, to be able to write, analyze, and summarize texts. And even more worrying is when you talk about maths. 1 out of every 4 Europeans does not have the necessary level of maths to be able to operate in a normal environment, i.e. multiplication, division, equations. And when we talk about digital skills, and Jorge spoke a lot about digital skills this morning, there is where there's this biggest gap between different countries in the EU. There's an average of around 40% of people in Europe who don't have any digital skills, and within that 40%, 25% of that 40% have 0 digital skills. That is, 40% have a basic level and 25% have 0 digital skills. I think you probably all agree with me that nowadays you can't exist in this world without some kind of minimal digital knowledge, either to be able to connect to the wireless provision here in this room, or to buy something online, or to buy yourself an airline ticket. We simply cannot have our workers and tomorrow's generations in a situation such as that they have virtually no digital skills. The situation in Spain is worrying. We do bad at reading, writing, and maths. But also, in addition to that, those that are on the labour market, those that are in the age group between 16 and 74, still don't have many computer skills. And as for educational attainment of our students, once again, Spain is above the EU average, and only 10% of our adults are exposed to some kind of lifelong learning. In Europe, things are a lot better. The average is 11%. And in this current context in which the world is changing so rapidly and knowledge and technology is changing so rapidly, we cannot have people on the labour market who don't have some kind of minimum ongoing lifelong learning programs. Here you can see some figures that explain a little bit more about the labour market in Spain. Almost 29% of companies in Spain have difficulties finding employees with the right skills. 75% of Spanish companies say that they fund some kind of training for their workforce, but what isn't clear is whether that training is linked to the job or is linked to the job's priorities. And on many occasions there's a complete mismatch between the training that workers receive and the direction or the course that the company is following. And the professions, the top 3 occupations in Spain include agriculture, fishery, forestry, engineering professionals, and all those professions related to science and physics. However, the problems of the workforce that I've mentioned earlier is something that actually exists in other areas of the world. In a recent study carried out by PricewaterhouseCoopers around the world, many managing directors said that for them, accessing well-skilled labor is actually their fourth biggest challenge that their companies have to face today. In Europe, 40% of our companies cannot find the workers with the right profile that they need. And it's a paradox because we at the same time also know that there are 20 million people unemployed in the EU. So what's happening here? What's going on? There's a mismatch. We can't get people that are outside the labour market to fit in to what companies need, and what's happening is we're performing below our potential productivity. Companies also tell us that 27% of the job offers that they advertise are actually not filled because there's a lack of skilled workers, and that once again reduces those companies' ability to grow. What about the other side? What about the supply side? We can see that young Europeans feel that the education that they're being given actually isn't providing them with the knowledge and the skills needed to access the labour market. So the starting point for many of our youngsters is already the wrong one. They're starting on the wrong footing. So how can they possibly perform fully the first day that they arrive on the labour market? But what's more, teachers also say that they believe that the companies in their country, rather only 40% of those teachers believe that the companies in their country are satisfied with the quality of the graduates they receive. That's really worrying. I mean, like Jorge quite rightly said, people are paying more and more attention to what teachers have to say, not just because those are the people who are training our students, but also because we need to invest in highly trained teachers, teachers who are able to face up to the future, because the world of work is moving forward, and teachers are becoming more and more pressurized so that they can be the people who guide students onto the labour market. And it's hardly surprising, or maybe it is surprising, I don't know, that this week The Economist, a magazine which you've probably all heard of, has spent its special edition on teachers. A few years ago, this would have been unthinkable. Something is changing, something's happening in our labour market and in our education system. Something's happening in our economy for The Economist to spend a 10-page special on the teaching profession. There are many, many challenges out there. I'm not going to repeat them. Jorge summarized them perfectly well this morning. But in reality, it's very revealing that a magazine such as The Economist does that, and that public debate is paying more and more attention to the teaching profession. Actually, that's the good news. That's the good news. So what's happening? Why is there this lack of skilled workers, which is what the companies tell us? And what's happening with the lack of proper training that students get? Well, it's because there's this tremendous mismatch between supply and demand in the European labour market. As I said earlier, 40% of European companies or the European business community highlight that there are difficulties when hiring people. There's a lot of work to be done when reviewing and reforming our educational systems, because they're just simply not meeting the demand which is increasingly urgent and is coming round and changing quicker and quicker. In some countries, this actually reaches 70%. In the Baltic nations especially, probably that's due to the brain drain that many of these Baltic nations have suffered from. In Spain, it's not so high, perhaps because there's still a larger pool of workers to choose from. And unfortunately, there are more unemployed people. So, the European Commission, with its new agenda, has put out this new agenda to try to deal with this. It has three axes to it, this new skills agenda: quality and relevance of the skills and knowledge that's taught, 2, improving the comparability and portability of skills within the EU, and 3, improving anticipation and information about the skills that are going to be needed tomorrow, because we actually have realized that we don't have sufficient information sources or sufficient intelligence, as it were, on the data that could give us a clearer picture when reforming our education systems. So, what the European Commission has done is to try to firstly guarantee skills and knowledge. You've probably heard about the Youth Guarantee System. Well, the Knowledge and Skills Guarantee System, what it's going to do is going to require of member states that they provide a basic level of compulsory education that is up to the age of 16 to everybody, to all those people who don't have this minimum level. We simply cannot have on the labour market, on a labour market which is in tremendous crisis, where the demography is changing completely, in a greying population, in a market in which growth depends upon the integration and activation of all human capital. We simply cannot have, as I mentioned previously, that we simply cannot have millions and millions of Europeans who don't have, at the very least, basic compulsory education, a basic compulsory education certificate. This needs to be guaranteed through an individual audit of these skills and knowledge of those who are not on the labour market. The person will then be given a tailor-made offer of a training and education, and the next step will be to validate or recognize the learnings. Cooperation and partnership will be the first key principle to enable this guarantee, this skills and knowledge guarantee. We then are aiming for greater guidance and support mechanisms with all those stakeholders involved, and then a monitoring of the results and an assessment. And now I'd like to show you a video. I'm hoping that this video will work, and it's about skills and knowledge guarantees system and how this is going to work in the future.
Almost 70 million Europeans struggle with reading and writing. Even more have poor numeracy and digital skills. This is why the European Commission proposes a skills guarantee to give people a second chance to learn basic skills and help people who haven't finished school. The skills guarantee will help Candice gain the qualification she needs to work in the IT sector and do her dream job. Step 1. The skills guarantee will provide Candice with an assessment of her skills to identify existing skills and upskilling needs. Step 2. Candice will receive a tailored learning offer adapted to her specific situation. Step 3. Her newly learned skills will be certified. Yuri struggles with reading and writing and has difficulties coping with changes at the workplace. Through the skills guarantee, his employer can help him improve his basic skills so that he can keep up with his job. Candice and Yuri's new skills will be recognized and improve their work prospects. The skills guarantee will support member states to help people improve their skills and have them recognized. Europe's future prosperity depends on its people. Member states, regions, local authorities, employers, trade unions, civil society, and education and training providers all working together are the key to give people the skills they need.
Como habrán podido constatar, la garantía
As you may have noticed, this skills guarantee will also help those people who have low skills and knowledge level and who already are on the labour market, because there are people out there who run the risk or may be affected by a company restructuring and may lose their job. And why? Because many of these people joined the labour market 20 or 30 years ago. These are people who are in their 50s, who at any moment in time may be affected by an economic downturn, by some kind of a crisis in the company. So it's therefore important to invest in them so that they can increase their employability and then get back onto the labour market. So this skills guarantee is applicable to those who are outside the labour market and those who are on the labour market. And its aim is always to achieve a minimum education level equivalent to secondary education. We will be reviewing the European skills framework. We've noticed that despite it having been successful, the way it's been implemented by many member states is still far much slower than we'd like it to be. This has many consequences when encouraging mobility. If the business sector in other countries cannot recognize these skills and the qualifications of youngsters who come from other countries, then it's going to be difficult to help those that want to move around in the labour market. They're not going to be able to be successful if the business sector doesn't understand the equivalence of the education systems in other countries and how that fits in there with their own national system. We're going to encourage a greater use of the qualifications framework. We will insist on the quality and the improvement of credit systems and their portability. And in the global context in which we live and with the migration crisis that the EUs are going through, we will also coordinate more closely with third countries and neighboring countries such as countries in the Middle East and North Africa, so as to be able to recognize the skills and knowledge of those people who come to us from outside the EU. We will showcase vocational education and training. It's not just pure coincidence that the new European Commission has decided to move from the DG of Education and Culture to the DG for Employment, the two units that are in charge of vocational education and training and skills and knowledge. It says quite a lot about the future of VET. It needs to be integrated and located within the world of work. Of course, working closely with educational authorities and authorities in general, but it also needs to be firmly rooted in the labour market. So we're going to propose that the European VET credit system be reviewed and that there be a guarantee of quality in European VET. We will encourage at the workplace learning, dual training and mobility. Mobility in the case of VET usually is only for short periods of time. Why? Because they're usually the young people that are mobile. But what we'd actually like is to trial and to encourage and see a program such as Erasmus, which has been so successful at a university corporation level, perhaps transferred to the world of VET. Why don't we think about 6-month mobility and training periods in the world of VET? The demand is out there. However, we're not able to cover it because of budgetary problems, which we will be reviewing, and that in the new European Union funding framework will be increased. For the first time this year, we've organized the European VET Week. in December in Brussels. But it will be held at the same time in all 28 member states. Throughout the whole of Europe between the 5th and the 9th of December, there will be events, meetings that will showcase VET. We also want to simplify governance processes European-wide, and this should also be done, if possible, nationally. We will encourage digital coalitions, not just European-wide, but also at a national level, so that all the stakeholders of the labour market can come together and be coordinated, and in this way head off these gaps that we pointed out in the first slide, the gaps in skills, the lack of skills in the labour market. There will also be greater branch coordination, initially at a European level with the European associations of 6 key industries, which is the space industry, automotive industry, maritime transport, defence, tourism and textiles industries. The idea is that these European platforms then filter down and repeated nationally. There will be budgetary money to do so, there will be funding to do so, so that new cooperation and governance methods can be experimented in skills and education at a branch level and at a national level. We'll also be monitoring degree holders. We need to know how they progress. We need to know how they perform. We need to know the route that these graduates follow in different subject areas, so that we can find out how employable they are, what their future possibilities are, and what sort of demand there is in different fields and different sectors. Because there's no point in carrying on offering courses that don't take youngsters anyway, just down a cul-de-sac, and makes them have doubtable employability. So this is a summary of the European Skills Agenda. I've highlighted the key elements that I think are perhaps most relevant for you. There are other elements that you might like to peek at on our website, but the main aims can be perhaps summarized in the following way. Firstly, to improve basic skills levels. Secondly, to accelerate the introduction of the EQF. Thirdly, to satisfy the needs of the labour market. Fourthly, to invest in digital skills. And fifthly, to promote and showcase VET, vocational education and training. I'd like to show you a final video which summarizes the European Skills Agenda. Thank you so much for coming. I am here to answer any of your questions during coffee or whenever you would like.
By 2025, almost half of all jobs in Europe will need highly skilled workers. In the future, people will also need some level of digital skills for 90% of all jobs. The lack of basic skills in Europe is striking. 1 in 5 Europeans struggle to read and write. 1 in 4 Europeans have poor numeracy skills, and 40% have no digital skills. And 1 in 5 Europeans lack a high school qualification. The skills mismatch shows that Europe isn't making the best of people's talents. 40% of European employers cannot find employees with the right skills, and 30% of people work in jobs that don't match their qualification. Globalization and technology is fast changing the way people learn new skills, but their qualifications lag behind. The new skills agenda for Europe will help equip Europeans with more and better skills by investing in people's basic and higher skills, by better connecting the world of business and education, by recognizing skills learned outside of school. Europe, making the best of people's talents.
Pues muchas gracias, Gregorio de Castro.
Thank you very much, Gregorio de Castro, for having updated our knowledge.